It's called no-seum technology. So what they do is they take the spike, they create a structure of amino acids into a spike protein. And at the tip of that, they create a furin cleave, which is a structure that fits perfectly onto the ACE2 receptor, which only occurs in human lungs. So now they've engineered the coronavirus so that it won't affect bats anymore, but it will only affect humans. It becomes more virulent, more pathogenic. Not only that, he funded Barrick to develop a methodology for hiding the tampering. It's called seamless ligation technology, and it's a way of making the tampering seamless so that it cannot be seen. If you really were doing vaccine research, you would do the opposite of that. You'd make sure that all of your tampering was completely visible. But this was weapons research. It had nothing to do with public health. It was the opposite of what you would want to do. And then Barrick, during that 4 years of the moratorium, taught that methodology to Xingli Shi, the Chinese bat lady who was the director of gain of function at the Wuhan lab. And the Chinese were very, very open. They didn't pretend they were doing vaccine research. They were very, very open, as I show in my book, in admitting that they were doing weapons research. And they even talked very specifically about how to develop delivery systems, how to freeze dry the microbes they were creating, to spray them on cities, that the strategies for spraying them at night to make sure there was no precipitation because the sunlight weakens the viruses. They were, extremely open that they were doing weapons research. And then, one of the things that I uncovered in the book that people, I think, will really be shocked about is this whole string of simulations that they were working on together. And a lot of people, a lot of your listeners will know about Event 201.
Absolutely.
And Event 201, for the few people who don't know, you can go on YouTube because strange enough, it's still up on YouTube. Event 201 was a simulation of a coronavirus epidemic that took place in New York City at the Pierre Hotel in October 2019.
That's right.
Now, just for context, you have to understand that we now, according to the national intelligence agencies, the coronavirus began circulating on September 12th, 2019. So, and they know that from the satellite photos of the parking lot at hospitals at Wuhan. 3 of the Wuhan lab technicians were hospitalized with coronavirus symptoms. They have chatter on the internet. Also at midnight that night, the Chinese government went into the Wuhan lab and removed 22,000 samples of coronavirus, and they purged the public-facing websites of most of their gain-of-function studies, including those with Tony Fauci's funding revelations on them. So there was and the head of the lab was replaced with a high-level military official. So something happened at that lab that night that caused extreme alarm to the very highest level of the Chinese government. And that's a month before this pandemic exercise that was conducted. Who conducted that exercise? Who was there? The Silicon Valley internet titans all had kind of representatives there. There were representatives of the social media companies, of the biggest pharmaceutical companies, Johnson & Johnson, the biggest pharmaceutical and vaccine producer in the world. They had big media companies like Bloomberg and Washington Post. They also had George Gao, who's the head of the Chinese CDC. So the Chinese government knew that coronavirus was circulating at that point. And the head of the Chinese CDC is in New York doing a global coronavirus pandemic simulation. The 2 hosts of the day were Bill Gates and Avril Haines, the former deputy director of the CIA, who is now Joe Biden's national security Council, the number one spy in America, the head of the National Security Council, and she is managing the coronavirus pandemic as the head of the National Security Council, which is bizarre. And it's bizarre that the CIA was at a coronavirus simulation because the CIA does not do public health. The CIA does coup d'etats. Between 1947 and 2000, the CIA took part in 73 coup d'etats, mostly against democratic nations. 1/3 of the nations in the world they've tried to either successfully overthrow or attempted to overthrow. What are they doing at a medical conference? Well, what they were doing there had nothing to do with medicine. If you look at that simulation, they were not talking about how to get vitamin D to all Americans, how to get zinc to all Americans, how to repurpose medications, how to develop a grid system to connect the 11 million doctors all over the world who were frontline doctors who would be treating coronavirus and finding out what protocols were most effective, what medicines were effective, to develop protocols that could then be broadcast to doctors all over the world. They never talked about isolating the sick and treating them. They never talked about how do you preserve the Constitution and constitutional rights during a pandemic. What they talked about was militarized response, how to use the pandemic as an excuse to impose totalitarian controls on our country and countries all over the world. If you go on this and look at the Seminar 4, which is the longest and the last of the 4 seminars they had that day, it's all about censorship. It's specifically how do you get the social media companies to censor discussion of suspicions that this is a lab leak, that the coronavirus that is now spreading across the world was caused by a lab leak. One of the people who's very, very vigorous about making sure that this is something people are paying a lot of attention to is George Gale, the head of the Chinese CDC, close friend of Fauci, a close lifelong associate of Jeremy Farrar from the Wellcome Trust. And they're talking about how to hide the fact that this is a lab leak from the American people and from people across the globe. So when I started researching Event 201, I was surprised to find out that it was not a one-off event. And in fact, I was able to identify about 20 of these events, these simulations that have occurred since 1999. Collectively, they're called Operation Lockstep. And the problem that they were addressing was how do you get all of the liberal democracies in the world to pivot in lockstep and turn themselves into totalitarian nations? And they